Hello, hi everyone. You're welcome to Web Close Till Jam webinar, and we're so excited to have you on board. And from all over the world that you're watching this, this is put together by some amazing GDGs and DSCs leads across Africa, and we're glad to have everyone all over the world watching us right now. And we're so excited to have an amazing speaker here joining us today for the first section in person of Ben Moss. Ben Moss is a developer advocate at Google, an amazing personality, and we're here to have in his own first section. So we can't wait to get started. So let me allow Ben to come in, and then we start immediately. So.
Okay. Am I there?
Yes, you are. You can go on, Ben. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot. It's very exciting to be here. Thanks for organizing this, all these different groups, like 23 different groups, I think. A whole lot of groups across different places. Thanks for being here today, and I'm very glad to meet you all. I'm sorry we can't be there together in person. We brought the AMP Roadshow to 3 countries in Africa last year. We were in South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. People were wonderful and very enthusiastic and very friendly. We were very excited about coming back again this year, but now we're traveling nowhere. So instead of seeing you perhaps in your country, I am here in the attic of my house in New Jersey, near New York, where we are fortunately safe. I guess the good thing is we can easily get together this way. I mean, if you can get online, you can easily see anybody from across the world and there's no travel. That's the good side. So I hope you're all doing well and staying safe, and best wishes to everybody out there. We're going to be discussing a bunch of things today about AMP, also called AMP. There it is. See, I promised you, AMP. A few different things, and we're being a bit spontaneous today, but we're going to discuss what AMP actually is for those who it's new for, and then we'll be talking about actually how to make an AMP site. So I wanted to do a workshop with you all. We couldn't do a workshop today, but I'll do a workshop by myself. So I'll be making an AMP site for you very quickly and showing you how you can do it yourself after this call. And that's the wrong window. And here we are again. And then we'll be discussing how to use JavaScript in AMP, because making the AMP site will use almost no JavaScript, but you can use JavaScript in AMP now. We'll show how to do that. And if we have time, which we might, we'll discuss how to use Next.js to make this even simpler. We might talk about web stories a little bit, maybe the AMP WordPress plugin. I know WordPress is very popular across the world, and especially in the countries that we're talking with today. So there we go. And again, I'd planned to do a workshop, but we can't do a workshop because we can't do a workshop. But I'm urging you to try out these things I'm doing afterwards yourself. I'll be giving you links to materials you can use to go through the same coding exercises I'll be doing myself. If you have questions, please put those in. I think they're going to appear in the StreamYard chat here magically by magic. I don't know if that actually is true or not, to be honest. But if you have questions or comments, please put them in. And if I'm not going to see them, I assume Slick will let me know. Actually, I'm going to look over here. No, I can't. Never mind. He'll let me know if there's things happening in the chat. I want to be able to answer questions. And if you have comments, please make those comments. I'd love to answer those as well. So first of all, this is an awkward moment here in any presentation, the part where the slide doesn't load. Actually, this is just an animated GIF of a loading GIF. But you know how it is when you're looking at a website on your phone and you see this instead of seeing the site. It's not a good experience, and it's all too common. If you're like in a nice, like a city with great connections on a very high-powered device, you don't see this very often. But frequently, people are still on 3G or even 2G connections. Many phones are not very high-powered, and many websites are slow to load, and they don't have to be. I mean, the problem usually is they have too much JavaScript, too many large images. There's things you can do to make it better and faster for users, but those things require some effort. The problem is, though, without making the effort, your user's there staring at her phone, your site isn't loading, look how sad she is. Clearly not a good experience. So there are ways to make this better, and we think that AMP is one of those ways you can do that. Because making a site faster, you can do it, but it's complicated. You have to understand how to do lazy loading and how to reduce your bundle sizes and do various things that require a lot of effort. If you're working on a team full of people, maybe you reduce JavaScript on your site, maybe you take out some CSS, Maybe someone else will go back in and add a pixel or add a third-party JavaScript library, add a large image. It gets slow all over again. This is difficult. So AMP is there to make this easier for you to do. What is AMP? AMP is a lot of different things, but most simply, it's just really a web components library. What it is a series of things that get added to HTML. HTML was created about 30 years ago. As you know, it was for describing documents. It was for things like, this is a paragraph, this should be in boldface. It didn't have HTML tags for things like, this is a menu, this is a Facebook embed, this is an image carousel where I can slide images around the screen. Those things weren't part of the web. There weren't tags for those things. As the web became more capable and did more and more things, people used JavaScript to add these things to the web, which is great. The problem being that often you have too much JavaScript, it gets out of control, things get unstable, and things get kind of big. So what AMP does is uses web components to add extra tags to HTML to do those things. You see a few examples here in this beautiful word cloud. There's things like animation components, Instagram embed, it looks like there are some video players, all kinds of things, mustache templating. AMP looks just kind of like this. That's pretty simple. So if you want to embed a YouTube video, for example, instead of just embedding YouTube's JavaScript, you would use the AMP YouTube tag, which AMP has added to the HTML. You'll see some attributes here that are familiar, like width and height. AMP wants you to use those things on everything that you add, because another goal of AMP, beyond making things fast, is to make things stable, so that if you're looking at your phone, for example, looking at an article or looking at a website, you might see that there's some text there, and then an image pops in, all the text moves up or slides over to the side as the image moves in. And you're looking at your page some more, and then an ad pops in, maybe a video pops in, and things keep moving around the screen. This is hard for the user to deal with. So with AMP, the size of everything is declared in advance. When you go to a site, the size of things is declared before you get there. That way there's space reserved for those things. As they load, they pop into their spaces. This has two benefits. One, things don't pop around the screen or move around. There's a more stable layout. And two, the browser isn't repainting the screen all the time. So things are faster and more efficient for the browser as well. So with AMP, it's best to specify width and height in advance. Also, there's a layout attribute there. The layout there is responsive in this case. AMP adds this attribute of layout. This will actually make this automatically responsive. And then finally, this data video ID thing. With YouTube, this is the important thing. This is the ID of the video. So adding this tag here to HTML will add a YouTube video to your page. We'll be doing this ourselves in about 5 minutes. If you have questions, again, put those in the chat. If I can't see the chat, actually, then hopefully Slick will copy these things into my StreamYard chat. So AMP, you can use it however you want to. But this idea of valid AMP. AMP does have rules and guidelines it sets out for what a fast site is and an accessible site is for everybody. If you follow the rules of AMP, you get the special benefit, which is that there's web spiders out there that are always looking around for valid AMP pages. When a web spider finds one of these pages, it will copy your HTML and put it into what's called an AMP cache. This is the keys to the AMP cache. And then your page gets served from, for example, Google servers, and it's served faster than ever than before. The cache will also optimize your page. It will make your images smaller. It will do some things to stop cross-site scripting attacks. It just makes things kind of safer and faster in general. And here's an example of that. Let me see if we can see here popping up on the screen. This is from Google search here in the US. You can see in some places there's little lightning bolts on some of these things. Those are examples of AMP articles. And in the middle, you see this little carousel. Actually, let's see this in real life. Why look at a slide? We can go to an actual real life. We're going to go here to a mobile simulator and see if we can fit the whole thing. Oh, most of it in there. There we go. We'll go to google.com. Other search engines do AMP caches as well, but Google's is the most well-known. Look for something in the news. Say, I don't know, look for something, I don't know, neutral. How about France? France is a nice country. So there's all about France, 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 France. Any news here about France? Here we go. Top stories. Okay, sorry, there's always bad news these days. You see lightning bolts on these things to indicate these are AMP articles. All of these things here are made with AMP. As we go down here on the page, we will see some more things here with these little lightning bolts on them. They're also AMP articles as well. If you click on one of these things, it loads extra quickly. This is because it's an AMP article, so it loads fast. But also, Google search knows that AMP pages have less JavaScript, and also it can control when images actually load. So it actually can preload much of this in an iframe behind the scenes, which happens in some cases, not all cases. If this happens, then your page is preloaded in the background. When the person taps on it on their phone, it loads almost immediately. This is very quick. And looking at this article here, let's actually take it out of the Google AMP viewer and just look at the article by itself. There it is. You can see some stuff here that's different in DevTools. I'm going to zoom this so you can see it a little better. Notice here on the top, HTML and a lightning bolt. That's different. Any valid AMP article has to have a lightning bolt in it. This AMP version thing over here, these AMP classes. Over here is an AMP iframe, which is an AMP component. AMP geo, AMP consent, which is used to get a paywall in there. All these kinds of things, AMP sidebars for menus. These are all AMP things. Those are all examples of AMP in how AMP looks and AMP in Google search. If you have questions, again, let me know. I'm going to actually go to this YouTube link while I'm talking to you because I wonder if there's actually questions happening here that I can't see. Although if I play it, let's see if there's any questions here. Nothing. Okay. So I assume that no one's asked any questions so far. Going on over here to our presentation. So there's the AMP cache. AMP does various things to improve user experience. Things that are slower are discouraged or not allowed at all. And also, I mentioned before, content doesn't jump around as things load. Also, ads that are distracting are not allowed. And also, interestingly enough, things aren't loaded until they're needed. So things like lazy loading happen with AMP automatically. What it will do is called viewport prioritization. If you have a page here and it's a long page and towards the bottom there's images or videos or things that are kind of big or anything which might take time to load, AMP won't load those things until the user scrolls towards them. So it will display the things in the viewport first and things that are below the viewport later. AMP does those things for you automatically. Here's an example of a site in South Africa that used AMP quite nicely. We see in many places in the world, AMP will give you better metrics on your site. It's not a guarantee, of course, but we found that when people have sites that are much faster and look better, they trust the site more, stay on the site for longer, you get lower bounce rates, you get more conversion rates. Not always, but you often get nice results. Superbalist is an especially nice example. Many of their landing pages you get to from search, they remade in AMP. What they did is they made the landing page in AMP. While you're on that page there, it uses AMP install service worker to install a service worker automatically. And then on the next view, you get into a progressive web app or PWA. So the first page of your experience is AMP, and afterwards you're brought into a PWA. So you get there quickly. Once you're there, you're in this nice immersive experience. Anyway, I was telling you just a minute ago that if you use AMP and you have valid AMP, you can get into this special area in Google search called the AMP top stories carousel. Well, Google is changing that right now. This is not changed yet, but what they're doing is changing it so that instead of requiring AMP for that top stories carousel that we saw, can I get back there easily? If I get back there, let's see, go back a couple pages here. There we are. There's the top stories carousel again. So at some point early next year, this will be changed. So instead of requiring AMP, it requires what's called Core Web Vitals. Google will be measuring these measurements of page speed and stability, interactivity. If they're really good, you can get into the top stories carousel. We think that AMP is the easiest way to do this because most AMP pages get there already anyway. Although it is possible to make a slow page with AMP, you can have large images. It's harder than other kinds of things. So this will be changing at some point in the near future, which is interesting, which makes it sort of like you can use AMP or use other ways to make your page fast. Here are those web vitals. You may have seen these before because various people in Chrome and WebDevRel at Google are talking about these things. These three measures here of largest contentful paint, which is how fast kind of the biggest thing that you'll see first gets drawn on the screen. First input delay, which is once you get to a page, Can you interact with it right away? Can you press buttons and things happen? Or is there a delay while JavaScript is loading? And cumulative layout shift, which is the visual stability we've been discussing, where the question is, do things shift around on the screen when the page is loaded or not? These measures will be used from now on to determine these things. Again, we feel that AMP is a good way to get there. Thus, we're still discussing AMP because we think AMP is worth all these things. By the way, I didn't say before that when AMP first came out, it was used on mobile phones only, but now AMP is quite good on all devices and for different kinds of purposes. In fact, if I go back over here and load up, for example, our own website we make, our team makes to have AMP documentation, there it is on mobile. Notice there in DevTools, this also is an AMP page. And if I go over here and go back to a desktop view, then same page, it's responsive, same thing, it's all AMP all the time. So this is a recommended approach because otherwise you may be finding yourself with an AMP version of your page and a non-AMP version of your page, which may be helpful in some cases, but is just kind of a pain to maintain. So back over here to our little presentation, there's that, there's that, there's that. So now I would usually do a workshop with you where you made your own first AMP site. We can't do a workshop, but I can do it by myself. So when you have time later on, go to this URL over here, glitch.com/tilde-showy-way, and this is our beginner course. You can do this here, again, on our website, which has all kinds of useful things. Go to documentation and go to courses. There are these 3 courses we made to teach how to use AMP and making sites with AMP. This workshop I'll do today actually goes through a lot of the beginning course. We can do it in a few minutes because I've done this before. It's pretty quick if you know how it works already, which I happen to because I wrote it. So anyway, go over here and try this later on. Glitch is a nice environment you can use to do online coding, so it's convenient for this kind of thing. You may want to use AMP Validator, possibly. ValidAmp may be important to you if you want to have your site go into the AMP cache, in which case there's a Chrome extension you can get that will actually show you whether your page is valid or not. Here you can see on my screen, it's probably very small, but I have a small lightning bolt here, which is gray next to the URL bar. If I go here to this AMP page, that will turn green. That means this is a valid AMP page. So you can use this to validate your AMP page and look for errors of some sort. I'll look for now, actually, I think I can find pretty easily. Here's an example of a non-valid AMP page on my local machine. It has 1 error on it, which you can't see because I don't think that StreamYard will show you the pop-up from the extension. But I can also, without the extension even, I can still go to the console here, or DevTools rather, and append development equals 1 with a hash to my URL and reload the page, and then we'll see error messages appearing in the console. I've zoomed it so much you can't really see it very well, but there it is. AMP validation has errors. Here's 1 error that it has. All right, let's close that. Let's go back over here to, I already have copied this. Oh, it's not loading. There we go, it's loading up. Okay, this is a version of that Show You a Beginner's course. I copied it in advance for you so we didn't have to wait for it to load. We're gonna use this to do a bit of live coding over here and make an AMP page from scratch. So back over here, oh yeah, let's write some code. Let's do that. So first of all, we're gonna use AMP image as our first AMP tag we're going to use. AMP doesn't replace a lot of existing HTML tags. I think it replaces maybe 2 of them with its own tags. It wants to replace image because it wants to be able to control how images load. It wants to be able to do lazy loading. It wants to allow responsive layouts automatically. It wants to also make sure that it can leave space on the screen for your item so that when it loads up, it fills up its space and things don't shift around. So AMP wants to control how images load. So for valid AMP image is required to be used. So let's do that right away. Let's first of all look at glitch here for a minute. Here's glitch. Here's this project. In this exercise here, we're not going to use our server or our node stuff. We'll just be using a couple of things. One is this file over here, index.html, which is an existing page, which is mostly AMP with 1 error right now. There also are assets over here in this assets area. These are all images. If I click on one of these images here, it pops up into a lightbox. You can see this long URL you can use to actually copy it and then use it in your project. Let me grab some water here. If you've got any questions or comments on all this, please stick those things in the chat if you're on the chat. Oh, here's the chat. Okay. Hi, people. How are you? All right. I see that you're there. That's good. Okay. Anyway, here we are. There's our basic starter code. So this is a pretty good looking site over here. Let's actually show it in a new window so we can see this beautiful site. It's about making cheese bicycles, which is not really a thing, but maybe someday we'll have cheese bicycles. Notice though, there is one error on this page, a single AMP error. And if we actually look over here, if we use this pound development equals 1 and load it again, we'll see the error in the console too. This thing about image. It says basically, blah, blah, blah. Did you mean AMP image? Well, we did. The thing is, we didn't use AMP image over here. If you go down to the bottom of this project, there's our image, but it's not an AMP image. So our first task is to convert this to an AMP image. Not hard, fortunately. We're just going to go over here and make that into AMP image. That was pretty easy so far. We're not done yet, though. We're going to close it because we like to close our tags here, AMP image. And then we're going to also add a couple more things for the AMP's purposes. We're going to add the size of the image because remember, that's important in AMP. So I happen to know offhand, this is 480 with equals, I can't type, 640. There's that. And now we have an AMP image and there's no validation errors. That was easy, right? Okay, so that's not very exciting really because it's just an image. If we actually go back over here to our mobile view, notice that it's cut off from the side of the screen. If you go to a responsive view, we can change the size of the window. Notice that when it's big enough for the image appears, but a smaller width, it gets cut off. This could be a bad experience for the user. Let's say you want to make it responsive, for example. Well, let's do that. Let's use AMP's layout system. Specify layout equals responsive. That's going to reload automatically. Hey, it's responsive. So all AMP components are responsive like this. You can use a responsive to make them responsive. You can use fixed to make the size not change after all. So now it will respect the size I gave it. There it is. There's various other AMP layout types. In fact, if I go over here and do a search on this very handy amp.dev here, we will see this nice page here demonstrating various kinds of layouts that exist with AMP. So the fill type, it takes the space available to it, the whole container. With fixed, it won't change from what you've specified. There's various different things here. There's a flexbox version, there's intrinsic, there's the container, there's responsive. So various ways to do images in AMP. So far, so good. Any questions so far? The code is not clear. Is it too small? Should I expand this? Is that any better? Okay, there we go. Now it's bigger. Of course, now it's cut off on the side, but now hopefully you can see a little more what I'm doing. If I do things that are not clear or in other ways, please let me know. Going back to this, to the top of this, you'll see more things that are common to AMP pages. Some things that are common are, we saw this before already, that in a valid AMP page, the HTML tag should have a lightning bolt afterwards or the word AMP. Also, you'll notice over here at the top, this bit of JavaScript. This is AMP's runtime. It loads this about 73K bit of JavaScript, which runs the page, helps various components work. You'll find that many components will require their own JavaScript. This is so that they're not all in one gigantic runtime. We'll see that in a minute, actually. You'll see more things down here. We're not going to really discuss many of them now, but for example, this meta viewport tag so that your site looks good on all devices. This is the AMP boilerplate, which will actually hide the page until the AMP runtime loads, at which point it will then show the page once it's laid out. And then over here, notice style AMP custom. AMP, for speed, wants to be able to display your entire page after a single network request. So it wants you for valid AMP to include your CSS right there in line in the page, and also have no more than 75K, so you don't have the page be too slow. This is a little hard to program with, so usually what you do, always what you do really in an AMP project is you have a build system where you build your CSS, and as a last step, copy it into your HTML pages, and then there it is. Again, these are things that are important for valid AMP. If valid AMP isn't important for you, then just go ahead and do whatever you want to do. Any questions on all those things there? Okay, at least the code is clear now. Let's go back and do something else. If you have questions, again, let me know. I'll talk a lot because it's what I'm here to do, but ask questions whenever you want to or make comments. Let's add a YouTube video next. So for YouTube, we're going to have to add a custom script. All these things are easy to find here on the amp.dev documentation site. Here's amp YouTube. See, even sometimes here in my home, there's a slow connection. Okay, there we are. So the required script at the top, you have the script that is required to make this work. They all have the same kind of formula. They look the same. When you look at them more than once, you've seen them all. Let's go here and copy this into the top of our project. So we're going to copy this here into the head. I have a big mess here because we're zooming our screen. It's going to look a little funny. There we are. Notice that this is async. All JavaScript is loaded asynchronously in AMP for speed purposes. We added that, and now AMP YouTube will work. And now we're going to go and find a nice video to embed. Let's see. Let's go to YouTube here. See what pops up. Always dangerous. Oh, look at this. It's about AMP. How about that? So this thing over here in the URL after the v equals is the ID. We'll use this over here to specify the video to actually show. So here from the documentation, you see in documentation, you have the usual things you'd use for AMP component, layout, width, and height. Data video ID is the one new thing. That's the ID of the video. For clarity, let's show that on a slide also. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here's how that will look. No, I didn't have that slide. Never mind. Anyway, there it is. As usual, width and height, layout optionally, and data video ID. Let's go back over here and add this somewhere. Let's say, I don't know, over here. So we're going to add this AMP YouTube component. Let's just close it to get started. And we'll add our attributes over here. So we're going to add a, I don't know, I think this will look good. I've done this before a few times. Height of 270, width of 480. We'll make it responsive. Then this data video ID thing that I found before. There we go. I have the JavaScript in there at the top. This should just work with any luck. Waiting for YouTube. There's our video. Look at that. It should be responsive. Yeah, look at that. Now can I stop this? There we go, I've stopped it. Okay, there's YouTube. Simple components. Someone's saying it's still blurry. I think this is about as big as I can get though, because if I get any bigger, I'll have problems seeing the screen. I apologize for that. There's a YouTube video, not too bad. Let's say you wanted to add in there some social sharing buttons at the bottom of the screen. Well, this project already has in here a handy class called social bar, which will let it look really nice if we do this. So we're going to do that. Let's add over here this div class equals social bar. And we're going to stick inside there some social sharing links. So that happens to be a component called amp social share, which looks like this. There's its JavaScript. Let's copy that in right now before I forget to do that. So there's a script. There's that one there. Make it look pretty. And then how to use it. It looks like you have a type equals something. That can be Twitter, for example, or LinkedIn. And that will give you a nice looking social sharing button. Okay, let's give it a try. And as usual, we have to specify height and width of things. You don't always have to, but it just makes AMP happier, and it usually will look better. So AMP, I can't spell it, AMP social share. If we say like Twitter, I think that with this CSS we have in this project, 44 is a nice looking size for it. Let me close that. And that should actually work, I think. Oh, look at that, a Twitter button. Let's add some more of these things here. I'm just going to copy that and add some more. Let's add a couple more things. I know LinkedIn also works. LinkedIn's, you know, the businessy thing. Email is also a thing. There they are. Beautiful. Okay. Any questions so far? We can get a little more elaborate too. there's a component called amp carousel. So this is a carousel of images or carousel of anything really, also called a image slider sometimes. This is where you can go ahead and slide things around on the screen or click things to make them move around. This kind of thing here. Amp carousel looks like this. You'll see a pattern here with amp. You have a component, you have a width and a height, and then you may have other things that might customize it with attributes. Here, for example, type equals slides. Slides happens to be the kind where you see one slide at a time. The other kind is carousel, where they're all shown at once. Slide shows one at a time. You can customize this in more different ways. You can add a loop in there so that it never stops. So it goes from the last one back to the first one. Autoplay, other kinds of things like that. So let's do this. But first, we're going to add the JavaScript, because when you forget that, it's so annoying. And actually, if we have time, we'll show a way to make that easier so you never forget these things. Or even adding them is optional. Be automated with Next.js. So there's what happened here. See, this formatting is messed up. There we are. Amp carousel. I'll go back to the bottom. Let's put it like below the image, for example. Here, image. Let's put it over here before the video. We're going to go amp carousel and the usual kinds of things. I happen to know there's a good height and width for those. And we'll make this responsive because we believe in responsive design around here. And let's use type equals slides. Make it also loop back when we're done. There's that. And then inside the carousel, it can be anything you want. It can be videos, images, bits of text, whatever you want. We'll use images because images are nice. What we're going to do is make this the same exact layout and dimensions as the carousel. So we're going to copy this for everything. And there'll be some sort of sorts here with the actual image in it. Actually copy that a couple times. And we'll find our images here in our assets area. Let's choose this beautiful cheese bike. Copy that. Go back over here. Stick that in here. This very long URL, which will then give us this lovely image. Let's get some more things from assets. How about this beautiful looking mouse, who seems very happy? And let's put that in there next. And then because the mouse seems like it's also a bit hungry, let's give it some cheese. Picture of cheese. Notice these images are all on the cheese bikes theme. And there's that. Is that it? I think there's more to it, but that really might actually be enough. Let's see if that works. Oh, look, our image carousel. Actually, it's kind of cruel because the mouse never gets to eat the cheese. It can chase the cheese, but it can never eat the cheese. Notice this is looping around because I have the loop attribute in there. Let's remove loop. And it will reload this, and it should just go from the first to the last and stop. No more. There's that. Okay. That's kind of neat. Easier than I expected, actually. I never live coded this before. Any questions on that? Our image carousel. Let's do one more thing that is a little more elaborate to show that you can do more with AMP than just add components. I think I've now gone through all these slides already. Yeah, let's go to this over here. So you can also handle events and actions in AMP. You can also do things with state variables and binding, kind of like Angular or React. We won't go into those things today, but we're going to go just a little bit into how it handles events and does actions based on events. So back in the olden days, we had jQuery, which was incredible. It's still very popular. So this example is still relevant. Let's say you wanted to have a button that could be clicked to hide a warning div over here in the comments there. Yeah, I'm sad about the mouse and the cheese. It would require some more CSS to put them, together. You could do that. Maybe as exercise for the reader, give the mouse the cheese. So here we are in this jQuery example, and you want to hide this warning div when a button is clicked. So you might use this kind of thing. You might give the warning div an ID of warning, and use the onClick attribute and button to attach an event handler, as you can do in HTML. And then use jQuery's magic to grab the div whose ID is warning, and then you hide it. So that format there looks probably very familiar to you. You can click, and there is that warning ID that gets grabbed, and then you can go ahead and hide it. AMP looks kind of similar to this, actually. Here's the same thing in AMP. AMP will take the click and the live phone tap events and combine them into one thing, and gives you this tap event. Tap refers to a button click or a tapping on a device. I have to grab some water here for a second. Much better. Yes, Gideon, this is a live chat. I can see what you're saying right now. So the tap event, you have a tap and you have a colon, and then the ID of something you want to do something to, and then a dot and the action. So in this case, it does the same thing. You tap this button, it will hide the warning ID over there. You can see more about this also on our website, as usual. If you go to events and actions, there's a nice discussion of it over here. And there is the format again with more possibilities, arguments, things like that. But the basic idea is the same. You have something, and it's like tap colon, the DOM element target, and then actions. Here's a similar thing over here, warning message dot hide. So this will be useful for us because we want to actually make a menu. And for a menu, you have to be able to tap a button to show the menu and a button to hide the menu. Oh yeah, there it is again in bigger letters, tap warning.hide. We have a question here about adding a new script tag. Most AMP components do require a bit of JavaScript, about 8K, 10K, and that way you can have the AMP runtime be smaller and just add things you actually need so that you have as little JavaScript on your page as possible. There are ways to make this easier to remember. If we have time, I'll show you those ways before this is over. So we're going to add a menu over here using the AMP sidebar component, which shows a sidebar, which is this typical menu comes from the side on a mobile device. And there's actions you can use to show or to hide the sidebar. Open and close and toggle will do this. I can show you these things in the amp.dev site, but time is kind of short, so we're just going to do it. So let's add this sidebar. Now for the sidebar to be really happy, it wants to be a direct child of the body. It doesn't need to be, but AMP will automatically add this overlay to the screen when the menu is being shown, and it looks best if you add the sidebar as a direct child of the body. That's what we're going to do over here. I happen to be now remembering some things here that you need to do to make this work nicely. The sidebar class, we already have it in the CSS making this look nice. We're going to call this sidebar 1. And when you first load this up, it should be layout equals no display. That's because it's not being shown yet. And it'll come off at the left side of our screen. So there's that. And then inside this, we're going to start out with this button. We're going to give this the class Navbar trigger, which in our CSS will make it look really beautiful. Use role equals button because this is for accessibility. Someone's using a screen reader or other kind of device, they can then know it's a button and use it. And similarly, if you use tab index, you can tab around things if you're using a keyboard. These things are required in AMP for accessibility purposes. And now comes the exciting part. We're going to say, when you actually tap this thing, find the div that's called sidebar1 with the ID of sidebar1, and we're going to toggle its state, which will mean, actually, sorry, this is for closing it. We're inside the sidebar. So we want to actually close this because it'll be in the menu. This is the close button. So we're going to say, here's a little X here for closing it. I think actually I have lying around on my computer here a nicer X, which is like the little extended character X. Oh, that looks nicer. Okay, that'll look better. And then we're going to have a bit of a menu in here, like a nav bar. I know we have the class equals nav in this thing. And if we just have inside that a little typical unordered list with this label class, nav items in there, we can then have some bogus stuff in there like a link. There are no other pages in this project. We're just going to have this go to pound. And we're going to say, because here we are in Africa, we can copy and paste a couple more of these things. Consistent, have them all say Africa. Let's do one for me because this is where I am. I'm in New Jersey. Okay, the beautiful looking menu. I'd want to use this menu anywhere. We're almost done with this actually. There's our menu, but we lack a way to open it. So we're going to stick in our header over here a little new div. Let's make this header a little bigger so it can fit more stuff in it. And we're going to have at the top of this here with the class Navbar trigger, which we used again a minute ago, which will make this look nice in our CSS. We're going to again have role equals button and tab index equals 0 because it's the first thing you would click on the page. And again, the on attribute, when you click or tap on this, find that sidebar one div and toggle it again, which will open it. And then we should make this look nice. I have over here, again, a little hamburger menu thingy. There's that. Okay, well, this is called sidebar 1, and this should toggle that when it's tapped, and so should that. Let's see if this works. And I have the JavaScript in there. Do I have the JavaScript in there? I don't. Okay, so let's just get that in there now, shall we? Let's get the amp sidebar up here. And there's our JavaScript, make the sidebar work. We're going to copy that and stick it in here. Once again, this looks funny, so let's do this. Okay. That might actually work. Let's see. Oh, there's the menu. Does it work? Well, it does work. Again, I've done this before. So there it is, a beautiful menu and not hard to make. And there it is. Any questions about all of that? I see a question about the new script tag. I was saying a minute ago that most AMP components do require their own JavaScript. Just go look over here at the documentation on amp.dev. You'll see an area called required scripts. If it's there, you have to add it. Again, if you use next.js, these things are added for you automatically. Also, the AMP optimizer does that automatically. I can show you this really quickly over here if I can find it. If you're using AMP on your domain, this tool over here, AMP Toolbox Optimizer, no, that's the wrong one. It always appears in search first. This here will do a bunch of things, including, notice over here, automatically import all missing AMP component scripts. We made this node module that did this before, and the guy who made AMP Optimizer liked it and made his own version and put it in here. So it will then automatically add any AMP component scripts that are missing for you. Pretty handy. So that's our little demo here of how to make an AMP page quickly. Not too bad for about 20 minutes of honest labor. I had more things to discuss. I'm kind of running out of time, which is not surprising. So I'll just keep on going through things. If you have preferences, I was going to show you how to use JavaScript in AMP a little bit. We also can discuss web stories a little bit, the WordPress plugin a little bit, or show next.js and how next.js makes it really easy to use AMP. If you have a preference among any of these things, using JavaScript, next.js, web stories, or the WordPress plugin, stick a comment there in the chat and we can maybe do what you prefer. For now, because we're here and only have 14 minutes left, I'm going to go into this little bit over here about JavaScript. I was saying before, AMP discourages you from using your own JavaScript because it's got JavaScript of its own that makes things happen. If you use your own JavaScript in an AMP page, it's not valid AMP. The idea being that JavaScript makes things slow, and you're supposed to be able to make pages without using JavaScript at all. So for valid AMP, JavaScript is not allowed. It can slow things down on your pages, but JavaScript is now possible in AMP thanks to web workers. Web workers have been around for quite a long time, about 10 years actually, but they aren't used very much because, in fact, they're hard to use because they actually can't access the DOM directly. A worker runs in its own thread somewhere else because if you have different kinds of threads of JavaScript all working on the DOM, they could get in conflict. JavaScript doesn't work that way. Browsers don't work that way. JavaScript is not thread safe. it'd be a big change to JavaScript and browsers to make this happen. So workers solve this problem by running in a whole different thread, and you can't just touch the DOM at all. All you can do in a worker is use regular JavaScript with some restrictions, not very many restrictions, and then you can send messages to the main thread or back from the main thread. That's all you can do. You can send a message and get a message. You can't touch the DOM. It's a limit. However, this has been made easier by a thing called Worker DOM. This is an open source library from the AMP project that essentially makes it possible to use the DOM in a web worker. How does this work? I was saying before that the web worker can communicate with the main thread by messages. So what happens is Worker DOM makes a copy of some part of the DOM, makes that copy accessible to the web worker. Then if the worker modifies its copy, Worker DOM notices this, does an intelligent diff of the DOM, kind of like React would do, and sends a message back to the main thread saying what changed in a very kind of compressed format using array buffers. Also, if the main thread notices the DOM has changed, Worker DOM will notice that, again, do a quick diff, send the difference over to the web worker, so it keeps things in sync between the worker and the main thread. It's a bit slower than just changing the DOM yourself, but it's actually pretty quick. So I said this before, it diffs the virtual DOM and the actual DOM, it goes to changes, and sends those along to the main thread. Here's a simple hello world example using this AMP script thing. AMP script is a component which encapsulates Worker DOM, makes it possible to use Worker DOM in AMP. AMP likes this because they can control what's happening. So if you do a lot of JavaScript down, and also it can make it so that shifting around too much, it also can control how much JavaScript you actually use. So your page isn't too slow. So here's a simple example of this. Here's an AMP script component. As always, we have this layout attribute. We have this height and width attribute for the size of it, and name of the script in this case. And there's a little DOM in there saying h1 hello. Yes, as they're saying there on the comments, exactly. It's like virtual DOM in React. It's very, very similar. A bit different. But people that work on Worker DOM also work on things like Preact and other kinds of similar frameworks, so it's very similar. So yes, h1 hello is actually all that AMP script is going to send over to the Worker DOM. The entire DOM is going to be able to use. So it uses that DOM over there. My mic is switching. Is that true? Actually, I can hear it very well. Is there a mic problem here? Let me actually unplug and replug this microphone in case there was a problem. Hold on a second. And is that any better? Can you hear me? If I'm audible better, let me know. Let's see. I'm on my side at least. So hopefully I'm on your side too. So that's the DOM. Oh, great. Okay. This is the DOM that it will send over to the worker. And then on top over here is our JavaScript. Pretty simple. Notice it's type equals text plain, not text JavaScript, so that the browser won't just see it and execute it right away. And then Worker DOM and AMP script can grab it and put it into a worker and use it there. And there's a simple example where we just grab the h1 there, using a simple DOM method and add the word world, and there it is. So actually, I have some examples like this here allowing another glitch, like this one over here. Let me see if I can show this over here. Here's a hello world example I just mentioned to you a minute ago. There's AMP script over there, and inline over here is the actual script itself. If I show this in a new window, there's the examples. So here's hello world. Oh, look at that, hello world. So that isn't that exciting, really. But I actually did use a worker. I can show you here, if we look in the sources, you can see on the bottom this long-looking thing. And we see over here something else we can then open up. You can't see anything because this is so small. But maybe there it is. There's our JavaScript sitting here in this worker beneath all this Worker DOM stuff. So this actually is being done not by the DOM API, but by Worker DOM, which has simulated all these APIs in its own JavaScript and made copies of the code with things like get element by tag name, and there it is. We have some more examples we can show here real quick. A more glamorous example over here, hello button.html. That is a button. Here's HTML for that. It just has two things in it, this hello and this button over here. And then it loads this JavaScript externally, which AmpScript allows you to do. Here's, hold on, where's the tag? AmpScript, there it is, source equals js/hello button.js. Here's that file. It simply grabs the button and it then adds an event listener where when you click, it grabs the H1 and adds the word world to it. If we go back here and show that example, hello button. Hey, look at that. So these are dumb examples, but you can do a lot with this. You can also, of course, do a fetch because fetch is possible in workers. Time is running short, so I'm not going to show this, but there is a fetch example, same kind of thing, except that the JavaScript for that does a fetch. And when you get the response, it then sticks it into the H1, and there it is. Let's go back to our presentation over here. If you have questions, let me know. To try this out yourself, try this tutorial, which we just recently redid. I'm very happy with this tutorial. It shows you how to make an interactive form that takes an AMP form and then makes it much nicer using AMP script. If you go to go.amp.dev/learn-script, you can find this tutorial. And all this code I just showed you over here is in this other glitch, glitch.com/tilde-amp-script-webdev. Now, I was saying before that what Working On will do, what it does is it recreates DOM APIs in its own JavaScript. So it can't reproduce the entire DOM API because it's got thousands and gazillions of methods and properties and so on. What it does is it takes ones that are used most commonly and supports those. You can find this at go.amp.dev/amp-script APIs. Not everything is there. So if you just try to copy, say, jQuery into AmpScript or your favorite image carousel library, other kinds of things, it probably isn't going to work. You have to modify some things that are so they're supported. You also can't do things, you can't add your own JavaScript, for example, because that would be breaking AMP's rules for performance. You can use fetch, you can use WebSockets, you can use Canvas, you can use a lot of things, not everything. So to make things with AmpScript, either can just look at this table here and use things on this table, or if you prefer, it's been tested with lots of different frameworks. If you use Vue or React, Angular, Lit HTML, things like that, the team that made Worker DOM, actually the guy who made Worker DOM really mostly by himself, again, knows these frameworks very well. And these frameworks, they do a diffing of the virtual DOM and the real DOM and use certain DOM APIs to change the DOM. So he made sure that all these APIs were well supported. So if you just use these frameworks, things just kind of work. The one problem is sometimes their bundles are very large, and AMP wants you to have 150K of JavaScript or less because, again, the goal of AMP is less JavaScript and faster pages for every user. So I recommend that instead you use what's called Preact. Preact is like React. It works in many of the same ways. Much React code can be just changed in small ways and made to work in Preact, but it's only 3K minified and gzipped. Preact is pretty handy. I recommend trying that if you're doing anything which is at all complicated. Again, things that are not too complicated, 100 lines of code or so, you can use vanilla JavaScript. If it gets more elaborate, maybe Preact is easier. And here's an example of Hello World in Preact instead. I'm not going to show you this now because we're almost out of time, but briefly, you just make your little component there, and it's the same kind of thing. There's our button, and Preact does the rest. We got about 5 minutes left over here, and I have more slides to show than I have time for. Do you have any questions on all this stuff you want to put in the chat? I think I can discuss one more thing, whether it's stories or WordPress or how to use Next.js with AMP. Does AMP support WebSockets? You can use WebSockets in AMP script, so you can do it that way. There's no components for WebSockets. Although there's a similar kind of thing where you can do a live blogging thing in AMP. But for WebSockets, you can use AMP script. Any questions that are not from Slick? I assume I had that question there. Why Preact? Oh, there's your comments. I just found them in StreamYard. Look at that. Why Preact? If you're doing things that are complicated at all in AmpScript, Preact may be easier because the DOM APIs that Preact uses to make its magic happen behind the scenes are all supported very well in AmpScript. But if you're using AmpScript, you can usually use it for smaller things, for customizing kinds of smaller interactions. And in those cases, you can use Preact, you can use React if you want to, you can just use plain JavaScript. Any other questions? How can you use AMP with other JavaScript frameworks like Angular, Vue, and React? Mostly through using AmpScript, because AMP is really supposed to be designed to be used with less JavaScript. Using a framework like JavaScript with AMP doesn't make a lot of sense unless you're using it on the server side. And again, Next.js is a great way to use React to server-side render your AMP components, do all your wonderful React magic on the server, and then just serve static things to the user. If you want to control the page with a framework, you can do that in AMP script. But it may also be true that you shouldn't be using AMP in the first place because AMP is really about more kind of simpler, not totally simple, but more simple interactions with less JavaScript, which are faster for the user. You can do e-commerce applications and more things with AMP, but usually it's well suited for interactions that are not so complicated. Now I see a lot of questions coming in. You can't use JavaScript in AMP as it breaks its rules. So how with JavaScript libraries like React? Yeah, I don't have time to show you this anymore, but I can show you really quickly here. I had an example to show you, which is very nice. Next.js and AMP work very well together. Next.js, lets you server-side render with React. And it's really simple to use, actually. If you just export this kind of, actually, here's a better example. Let me show you this over here. Web.dev. This in the chat too, if I can do that. I don't know if I can do that. I guess I can't do that. This is a good guide over here to using Next.js with AMP. So you just use, usual React stuff over here. You have to import AMP library, and then you can just use this config live thing to say AMP as hybrid mode or true, and then you go ahead and make your page with components as you'd usually do in React, and it adds everything else for you. All the AMP boilerplate stuff, all the JavaScript that's needed is all added automatically. So if you want to server-side your page here we go. This is better. Use AMP from next/AMP, and then there you go. It's very simple this way. If you use React to make your pages on the server side, a great way to do it. PWA and AMP are kind of different ideas. They work well together, though. You can actually use PWA and AMP together in a few different nice ways I can't discuss right now because there isn't much time for that. But there are some nice talks that we've done before you can find online. The most common pattern, though, is to use what's called AMP install service worker. Let me show you that real quick over here. I can find it on the left, can't I? This is a nice component that installs your service worker on an AMP page. Then it runs the service worker. So the user is looking at your content. The page loads very fast. It's looking at your content over there. And then service worker loads in the background and loads up and takes control of the page. On the very next click, the user is then brought into your PWA. It also is possible to embed AMP inside a PWA, which is kind of a cool pattern. But I can't show you that now because we're totally out of time, I think. Let me just go ahead here and go to my last slide because we're out of time. There were stories. Oh, look at all this stuff here we could have talked about. AMP.next.js. Oh yeah, the thank you. Unless I have more time, so you can let me know if I do. I assume we don't have more time. I'm seeing I have 3 more minutes. Wow, okay. Let me know when I'm out of time then. How does AMP handle slow network connections? It doesn't do so explicitly, but it's nice because AMP is built for slow network connections. So it's built to load as little JavaScript as possible and as few things as possible. So it's able to do things pretty fast. I also recommend if you're using AMP on your origin, use AMP Optimizer. As I showed you this before in the talk, that can also make AMP even faster and make things appear even more quickly. A few extra minutes. What should we discuss for those minutes? Let's go back over here and talk about WordPress. If you're using WordPress, try the WordPress plugin. There are a few plugins here that use AMP. This is our favorite because we made it ourselves with XWP and other agencies in collaboration. amp-wp.org. It's nice because if you're using WordPress for your site, you can use AMP, and without thinking about it at all, your site's just kind of faster in the background. It works the same way, it looks the same way, it's just a lot faster. It's kind of a good use case for AMP because it just makes things faster without you worrying about it too much. There's a lot of themes and plugins that are supported by AMP. Every major theme like 2016, 2020, and so on are all compatible with AMP. And it does things like automatically will convert images to AMP images. It will take your CSS, put it in line. It will remove custom JavaScript to make valid AMP. It will break certain plugins. You've got to find plugins that are AMP compatible, or you have to go through and then make those plugins not use JavaScript. I found that most plugins I use weren't that important in the first place, or I could rewrite them with no JavaScript at all, or use AMP things instead. But you also can make pages that are not valid AMP if you want to, which use JavaScript and use AMP. One nice thing that it does is called tree shaking. If you have a lot of CSS on your page, as many WordPress pages do, because WordPress pages are full of plugins that add their CSS, this plugin will go through and find the unused CSS and remove it. So each page has just CSS that's being used. It's a pretty handy thing, kind of hard to do, and part of the WordPress plugin. So try it out if you're using WordPress. I think we're out of time again because we're now past those 3 extra minutes. Any other questions? Or are we now out of time? Looking back here. Oh, okay, there we are. Hi. I saw you for a minute, Slick. I'm going to unpresent because I assume that we're done. Thank you very much for your time. And if you want to find me on Twitter and ask more questions and make more comments, I'm at Ben Morse. Thank you so much.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for your section. It was amazing having you. One last question before. Sorry, Tara, we actually took 3 minutes extra, so we just want to take like 2 minutes extra. Sorry, 5 minutes. That's 5:05 you start. So kudos to everyone watching this across Africa. We're so excited to have you guys on board, and Ben has been amazing all through the sections, and this is really quite impressive. Even me myself really gained a lot. So thank you very much, Ben, for this amazing section. So one last question from our Slido. We have a question that says, what's the best possible way somebody that really want to get started in maybe in the programming field can start using AMPs, and how best possible way the person can start using AMPs?
That's a good question. One of the benefits of AMP that we didn't talk about at all is that you can use AMP as a beginner. You can use it as an advanced web developer too, because it does the things you're doing with JavaScript, but it does them kind of already for you. It makes things faster for you. But for a beginner, it's super nice because you can make a website with just HTML without using JavaScript at all. I recommend going to our beginning course. If you go to amp.dev and look for courses, I think I showed the URL earlier on in this discussion. Try the beginning course. It teaches how to use the web in general as just like a thing you can do, and also how to use AMP at the same time. So it goes into basics of the web and also how to use AMP. Easy way to get started. Once you're up and running and using AMP components and things like that, you can then go from there and learn JavaScript, learn more advanced techniques. It's a fine way to get started though. Sites that you're making also load very quickly, which is also nice.
Oh, awesome. Thank you very much for that section. And we're sorry that 1 hour wasn't that enough. Probably we're going to have you one of these days more in our webinar series. And you probably give like 2 hours to take more time for a study jam section, preferably. So you could actually take more time to take more of the people can understand how AMPs work better. And thank you for the amazing resources you've shared so far. And we are so excited to have been blessed with your section. Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us both here. I really appreciate being included in this cluster jam.
Yeah, awesome, amazing. Thank you very much. So we hope to have you some other time.
Thank you. I hope so too.
Yeah. All right, bye.
All right, take care. And we're still here. Hello.
Sorry. Okay. Hi, Tara.
Hi, Slick. How are you?
Oh, it's amazing. I'm so glad to see you.
I'm very
So
happy to be here.
we're sorry it took some of your time, and it's been amazing to have you on board.
No worries. Ben's always,
Yeah. So hello, everyone.
I was going to say, Ben always gives great presentations, so it was nice to watch.
Yes. So we too will give extra 5 minutes afterwards. Okay. So hello, everyone. We're so excited to have you. So we're going straight in the second section, and we're meeting Tara. Tara is an amazing person with a very beautiful smile. Thank you for coming on board.
Thank you for having me.
She's a Google developer expert as well. She's presently at Netlifyedge, and she's going to bless us with a lot of amazing things around Jamstack. So let me leave the many ones for Tara to come on board. Thank you, Kara. So over to you, Tara.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and get my screen shared up. We'll go here, share. I'll hit present. All right. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
And it's just my slide, not my notes.
Okay, no problem. So let me go.
All right, so I'm guessing you're all set. Hopefully, if not, chime in and let me know if anything is off, or if you can't hear me well, or if you can't see the screen well. So we're here today to talk about Inside the Jamstack. First of all, I'm really happy to be here. Sarah Drasner sent me the invitation from Slick, and I was so excited to jump on board. It's amazing how many different groups are here today, so thank you very much for having me. You're going to actually hear a lot of the technologies that Ben talked about, kind of hear them come up a little bit in my presentation as well. And what I'm realizing is there's a kind of a centered stream of developers now these days trying to make everything about the web more accessible. So making websites more accessible in the fact that they deliver faster no matter your connection speed. And also it's more accessible for the developer to actually develop these sites. So making these tools easier for people who may not be as technologically advanced, but also robust enough to definitely keep developers able to do a lot of things with the technologies. So we're going to be talking about Inside the Jamstack, the technology that gives us these more reliable, fast, and secure sites. As Slick said, my name is Tara Mniksik. I am a Netlify senior developer, experience engineer. Forgot what my title was for a second. This isn't a very familiar field or position to many people. We have a lot of focus on the developer experience at Netlify because we are a tool for developers. So we have a ton of stuff like Netlify Dev that helps you with local development and computing. And then we have all kinds of things that bring you out to global distribution, like our content delivery network, which I'll talk about later on in the talk, and things like analytics and forms and authorization with Netlify Identity, all these things that developers need to use. So they hired a bunch of us developers to go through the process, see what works well, see what feels right when we're developing, and actually work with the product team, even take product rotations to fully join the product team to actually take that input back, put it in the product, get information from you, and change the code to make it better in that experience, and also bring to you tutorials and different examples to help you see what the product team has engineered specifically for you. So I just wanted to kind of give an overview of that because not many people are aware of that kind of position. And as Slick said, I'm a Google developer expert, web technologies and Angular, and one of my most proud positions currently is being a totally nerdy mom to these two creatures in my picture. The furry one is my dog Toshi, and the fat one is my baby Nico, who just turned 18 months. So that's the hardest position I've ever had to work in, but I enjoy it. So that's me. Now let's talk about what we're here to talk about, the Jamstack architecture. And I want to start out with this approach to it that we help to kind of give a high-level overview of what the Jamstack is, because the Jamstack is a pretty new approach, a pretty new architecture. So here are some 4 key things to help you understand what the Jamstack architecture is. Generating cacheable static assets, deploying to a CDN or content delivery network, using client-side JS to utilize third-party APIs and serverless functions. It looks like my text editor understood that serverless isn't a real word, so it's separated, but in tech, serverless is one word. And then finally, creating a better development experience through automated workflows. So this is how we approach it, right? It's very high level. And you may be thinking right now, what do you mean? What? So I try to break it down a little bit with talking about the technology inside of these processes that we just covered with that high-level overview. So we're talking about delivering content faster by serving pre-rendered HTML and CSS. Oh, so these are like the process. This is the process of how we accomplish those goals that the Jamstack architecture gives you. So we're basically saying we want to take the content that we have for our site and make it into a small file size, make it harder to penetrate security-wise by just serving up HTML and CSS. And then we make it fast, delivered fast, not only because it's small, but because we're putting our assets on edge nodes closest to the user, requesting to load fast. So this is where we talked about in the last slide. We're pushing things to the C, and we're talking about these dumb server edge nodes that are as close to the person requesting that information as possible. So they're the static assets. They're not going back and forth to the server to get information. It's the static assets on a node closest to the user so that it comes through fast. And then we're also saying you don't have to worry about all that server setup, having to figure out pricing and everything for servers. These are dumb servers. It's okay. They're inanimate objects. We can call them dumb. That we're putting all of our information on. And then we're dynamically grabbing data from APIs serverless functions by triggering serverless functions. And this is the evolution of a static site, basically. We used to just have these static assets that went back and forth, but we can make them more dynamic now. And how we make them more dynamic with dynamic interactions and dynamic data is grabbing the data using APIs and by triggering serverless functions. And because of this approach, we're decoupling and modularizing the development process, because we're actually decoupling and modularizing the technologies and using Git workflows or automation, which makes the development workflow less easy to break. It makes it harder to break when your technologies are decoupled, when they're loosely coupled, when developers are able to separate the front end from the back end. Can still be on in one company, but you're separating these things out, kind of separation of concerns. And then using a Git workflow to automate the process so you can make a lot of iterations fast and bring features to your users fast. So those are more thinking of the processes of what I explained the Jamstack is. But let's break it down one more time to really, and I feel like these iterations of like, okay, what is it? What is it again? Okay, tell me one more time, what is it? Always, that's the way I ask questions to help me really fully understand a process that I'm trying to learn. So here, I broke it down even more to basically the technologies we're using. So pre-rendering and static site generators. That's how we get those cacheable static assets. content delivery networks. So we basically made a full circle. We said we're putting on content delivery networks. Okay, what is a content delivery network? Then dynamic data from APIs and serverless functions. That's the technology we use to get that dynamic information and interactions. And then super simplifying down the better developer experience, we're going to talk about the Git workflow. There's so much more to what makes it a better developer experience, but these are basically the way that I wanted to pare this down to as simple a term as possible so that we can dig in, understand that term, that technology, or even understand who is providing those technologies, how do they work, and then we're able to say, okay, I have these building blocks. I understand the building blocks that make the Jamstack. So now I can start to build Jamstack architecture applications. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, those 4 bullet points. We're going to be talking about what they are, a quick definition of them, and then I'm going to give you the examples of the companies that provide them or the teams that provide them. And that way, that gives you all the pieces that you can research further to then create your applications. I'm not discussing in full what the Jamstack is or what the benefits are, because there are amazing resources out there to cover that. I want to kind of brush over that high-level topic and instead provide you with resources of varying times of commitment or various levels of depth of what they look into the Jamstack. Disclaimer, these are all from my coworkers, but I work on this amazing team at Netlify. You may know the team members. Sarah Drasner is the head of all of our DX department. There's actually a much more bigger term for it that I cannot think of right now. But Sarah Drasner, Phil Hawksworth, Jason Langsdorf, Cassidy Williams, Divya Tagtashian, they are, in my opinion, and I think a lot of the internet's opinion, the go-to for Jamstack resources. So let me share some of them with you. One, Jason Langsdorf on Learn with Jason has a lot of great episodes using a lot of the tools we'll talk about, but also he has this great post that's a nice quick read about what is the Jamstack, besides a goofy name for a great architecture. And he breaks down a lot of high level what it is and why it's a really great approach. Then to go in a little deeper, hit a little more topics, and have a few more resources, Divya Tagtashian actually came up with this whole thread of January, which is all of January. She wrote 1 post a day on the Jamstack, and she's been working in the Jamstack for many years. So she's had all these questions come to her from different people throughout the community, and she's addressing all of those in these posts that are really great quick reads. Highly recommend that. And then even more in depth, thankfully, Phil Hawksworth is a very entertaining and a very informative person, because this is 3.5 hours of learning the Jamstack. And it's a whole site that can introduce you to how to build it and just walk you through the process of the history and why it's so great. So check that at freecodecamp.org. Now let's jump into the technologies that are in the Jamstack. So the first bullet point we talked about, generating cacheable static assets. When we break it down again, we're saying pre-rendering and using static site generators. So what is a static site generator? Ben actually talked about some of these, but a static site generator, I'll basically parrot what I have written here, generates all the pages of a site at once when there are changes to the site. So it's generating everything at once when there are changes. So what you deploy has no moving parts. You're just sending static assets. This is really great for caching, which is a very hard mind bend of a process, caching in general. Excuse me. Because you're like, okay, what do I cache? When do I cache it? How do I cache it? When you have HTML and CSS pages and that's it, you know, oh, I want to cache that HTML page. So it makes that process a little simpler. And you'll see this thread of, you know, a simpler development process throughout the Jamstack, and as you may start developing Jamstack sites. It's harder to hack. So if you're familiar with WordPress and other CMSs that use third-party plugins, the third-party plugins have access to your site information, to your data, to your site. You will see throughout history, unfortunately, a lot of hackers will go in through that because it's easy access to hack into your site. It's not as easy to hack a static HTML page. So it's harder to hack in the sense that it's harder to hack an HTML page that just has some words on it. And it gets to the user faster. It's small file size. That makes sense. So every major framework or language has a static site generator. I am doing a lot of my work mainly in Angular these days. I have worked with red, blue, green, Angular, React, Vue throughout my career, even Backbone and a bunch of things throughout time. But I'm very excited because Angular is a really great framework, especially for big tools. And they're coming onto the Jamstack train. Just last year, the team from Hero Devs released Scully, which is the static site generator for Angular. And unlike some of the static site generators for other frameworks, you don't have to learn any other language. You just write in Angular, you ng add Scully. Scully scrapes your application, looks for the routes to make static, gives you the static assets. So you're not writing any Scully code. You're basically writing all Angular. Even you can use AngularJS with this, and just running a command, a Scully command. So that makes it really nice. But Angular Universal also does pre-rendering. We're hoping to get more. I'm very much hoping that the Angular team, whose plate is so full, I completely empathize, but we're hoping to get some more documentation because Angular Universal does have the capabilities. You know, we see it as a server-side render service, but it also has capabilities to do pre-rendering. So hopefully we'll get more documentation about that soon. React has Next, which Ben talked about next a bit. Cassidy on my team is doing a lot of great content. If you're curious how to do Next blog, like create a Next blog, she has a really great tutorial on our blogs right now. So React has Next and Gatsby. Gatsby is a powerhouse. My coworker Jason Langsdorff does a ton of Gatsby work, and you do have to learn Gatsby in order to use it. Like I said with Scully, you just are doing Angular. Gatsby kind of has its own code that you're working with, but once you learn that, it's extremely powerful. And then we have Vue that has, these are the two main ones. There are more for Vue, like there are Vue pages, but Nuxt and Gridsum are the main ones for Vue. I was thinking, I almost went off tangent, but I didn't do it. So if you're working with Vue, you have these great tools of using Nuxt and using Gridsum. Highly recommend checking those out. Use Vue. If you don't use any frameworks at all, there are tons of other tools to help you make to statically generate your site. I just wanted to mention a few here, but you can see they're not even, like there are some that aren't even written in JavaScript. 11D, very popular one. It is written in JavaScript, but it's independent of any framework. And then we have Hugo, which is written in Go. Slate and Jekyll are written in Ruby. Hugo and Jekyll have been around for a long time, and they're very popular. So those are great ones to check out if you don't have an affinity with a framework or you don't want to use a framework. But highly recommend checking out staticgen.com. There are so many on here. So you see the ones we talked about, Next, Jekyll, but there are all these other ones that do exist that do have a good amount of stars of view press. I think I said view docs before. It's view press is the other view one. But you see GridSim's on here at 11D. Middleman, which has been around for a while, but there's a ton on here. But if you look at this and you filter it by language, look at all these languages that are covered. And then all the templates, huge list of that. I also kind of show you scrolling through the license. If you care about that, there you go. There's some information on that. But this is all just to show there's so many static generators out there. So staticgen.com. I'll try to make a list of all these resources that I touch on because there are a lot, and I'll put it in my GitHub with the PDF of these slides, but also I'll send it to Slick as well. So moving on, deploying to a content delivery network, which you'll more often you will hear it be referred to as a CDN. CDNs, I've just the past few years have been learning about CDNs, and they're really quite amazing. So a content delivery network is a geographically distributed edge nodes that hold the deliverable assets sent from the origin server and serve as close to the user as possible. So these are basically dumb servers that are holding a copy of your information. They're not going back and forth to a server. They're holding your actual information on that edge node as close to the user as possible so that it comes to them as fast as possible. And we're talking about, too, the fact that, like, if you're not working with a fast speed, you don't have to make, we're not solving global latency. There's nothing that solves global latency right now, but we're trying to find remedies to make it not so bad. That's the technical term, make it not so bad. So we're doing this by putting static assets close to the user. The solution for global latency is putting your computer in front of them and showing them what you developed, right? So what's the next best thing? Let's try to get an edge node close to them and just put the static already built contents onto there. They do have redirect knowledge, which one of the simple ways to say, like, hey, I'm sending my assets to this node, something's not working. The node knows to redirect that content to somewhere else. That's a very simple way of looking at it, but redirects are actually extremely powerful because you're able to tell them when this person has this head information for this request, react in this way, send it somewhere else, send it to this thing, send it to, we'll talk about authentication and identity later, but it's like the header information doesn't have this role, redirect them to this login page, etc. So we're talking about, it makes it more reliable too, because if it just has that knowledge of, you got to send it to a different node, I'm not working, it's not going to say, hey, the information's not here, your node's not working. It knows to redirect it until it goes to a place that does work. So basically, a dumb server with redirect logic. Here, I wanted to give you I'm just realizing that the labels didn't come through, but I can tell you what each of these logos represents. It is always funny to me that, like, logos without names in them, it's like, oh, you're really putting a lot of faith in us to remember what your logo is. Nonetheless, so here we have Cloudflare in the top left, Firebase, which you are probably quite familiar with, Google Firebase. They have a CDN as well. And really, I love Firebase, especially for their CLI tools to help push everything up fast, and you get it on a CDN. I never pronounce this right, but it's Akamai, A-K-A-M-A-I, Vercel, and then Google Cloud and Rackspace. There are a lot more CDN providers. I didn't want to give you a total jumbled slide of how many are, but these are some of the more popular ones. And also, we have Netlifyedge. So Netlifyedge is, again, a globally distributed CDNs, this modern workflow, but we also do multi-cloud on the different levels of our Netlifyedge, which means AWS, Google Cloud, and DigitalOcean. If for some reason a cloud provider goes down, you have this redundancy of multiple cloud providers. And so, again, like some Smashing Magazines saw a 10 times boost in their performance when they switched over to a CDN. So that's why you see the main companies doing CDNs, because they're so powerful. And then you have this continuous workflow that you can integrate with the Netlify CDN and no infrastructure setup. So some of the things here that you see, so we support static assets. You don't have to have an origin server here. It can pre-render and run your builds for you. And this really cool Git CI/CD, which I'll talk to you about when we talk about the development workflow. But it's basically saying, like, when you push to Git, it can go ahead and do a bunch of checks. And then when you merge, it will do a rebuild for you. So you're just getting really fast iterations of the development of features that you want to push up fast. And again, automates the workflow for a better developer experience. These things I also talk about, but automatic deploys, automatic rollbacks, and cache invalidation. Rollbacks, if you know Cassidy Williams on Twitter, check her out. She just did a really great, we call them speedy bloops, but it's her video of basically saying why rollbacks are so important. And it's basically, you have these immutable deploys, these immutable builds. So you know, hey, push this build up. It worked great. That's fantastic. Next day, I pushed up this build and I broke everything in prod. Oh no, not that anybody's ever done that. Now you can just say, hey, remember that one that we did yesterday? Let's roll back to that one and push that one up. Forget I ever made that horrible, horrible mistake. So that's one of the beauties of a CDN like Netlifyedge that does this stuff for you. What's really cool, in my opinion, is that the CDNs are doing a bit more with the kind of logic they have. So we're still not having to manage servers, figure out the whole process for, the back and forth to the server, setting up pricing, figuring out how we're going to be doing auto scaling. You don't have to do all of that. You're basically delegating the stress of servers to the company like, Netlify or Rackspace or Cloudflare to manage these servers that aren't as complicated, but have more logic now. So there's this great, I put this post up here by Divya, what more can the CDN do on the Jamstack? Because not only is she she's just has a lot of information of working with CDNs for a while, but she talks here about basically they're doing more edge computing with CDNs now. So you're able to handle this crucial business logic like redirects and authentication, which we talked about a little bit before, on the edge. So closest to the user, but not making those calls back and forth to the server. So you're able to run functions on the edge layer. So your content can be delivered with close to zero origin infrastructure. So you're just working on that edge node is what that means. And then you're also able to do on-the-fly functionality like image optimization and access control, which is also achieved with this model of using that edge node redirect knowledge. So other companies like Cloudflare has Cloudflare Workers, Amazon has Lambda at Edge, and Divya is now working on, like what I said, she's on the DevX team, but she's doing her engineering rotation. She's working on the team to work on what we have now, which are edge handlers. So we're in preview mode with edge handlers, but I just wanted to show you. So this is basically when you make a redirect, you're saying, okay, I want to, this bottom line right here. So the route is going to come through as the request of the headers fetch. We're going to redirect it to hello route with a 200, but we're passing in this edge handler function called fetch hello. So all that's happening the JavaScript isn't in the code. It's basically a request coming through from the client that's hitting the edge node, hitting the redirect knowledge, and passing in a function. And there's a really great, because as much as I would love to talk about this forever, there's a really great video that we have from Jamstack Conf, which the videos from Jamstack Conf are really great. It was all virtual this year. Highly recommend checking it out if you weren't there yourself. But David Calavera, our CTO at Netlify, runs through. So this is the function that he is passing through that edge handler redirect knowledge and saying, run this function that is like looking at the header information, and from that understanding where the person who requested that information is coming from and displaying the data related to where they're coming from. So he did this with the COVID tracker data that we had. So if you were coming in from New York, it would show you just the New York information, et cetera, for whatever city that you were requesting it from. And that's not doing back and forth server requests. That is just hitting the CDN edge node, taking that request, passing in the function that it's calling from the request information. And it's not hitting the server back and forth at all. It's just saying, okay, here's that information. I know I need to give you this. So the possibilities are huge with being able to do this without that latency of going back and forth. You can just do this on the edge node. It's just work done at the edge. And it lands for many possibilities of localization, being able to give certain information that the person just needs for their location or their time zone or whatever other header information that you can get. I'm very excited about that. So check out Netlify preview for that, and we'll be having more come out about that at the next Jamstack Conf. So keep your ear to the ground. Moving on, this is, I think, one of the most maybe misunderstood parts about the Jamstack. Dynamically grabbing data from APIs or by triggering serverless functions. A lot of people immediately think Jamstack and think static. And we have so many capabilities. You may have worked with APIs or serverless functions before. There's so many capabilities that we can do now with this technology, with this modern technology, that make the evolution of the static site. We're able to deliver static assets so that they come through fast and then dynamically populate them, give the information to your users, make interactions dynamic using APIs and JavaScript. So let's dig into APIs a little bit first. API is an acronym, because there's so many acronyms in our industry, for Application Programming Interface. This is basically a set of functions or procedures allowing access to data and features using requests. You may have worked with these before and not even known it. So anytime you get or send a message on Facebook, or you check the weather on the app on your phone, it's making an API request to get that information. So it's basically, get message, and then then it comes back with like JSON or some other form of data to say message, sender, blah, 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 time, blah, blah, blah. So that's how you're getting information. And so a lot of third-party companies have APIs built in their system so that you can use their API just by making requests, but you can also build your own for your own company. So if you want to go through and make a bunch of handlers that say, I want to get the price of this product, here's the different way to request that information, here's how to edit that information. So you can make your own. There are a ton of third-party ones that exist out there, but those are APIs. So what are ways that we can use APIs to get things like data? Well, here are a bunch of providers. And we'll talk a little bit more about the process of how they do it, but data in general, we have the top left, AWS AppSync, Firestore, which you may be familiar with, MongoDB, is a database that has the API, and FaunaDB, we actually have an integration in Netlify to kind of do an add-on of FaunaDB to make it a little more seamless of a setup. Realm is the bottom left, Airtable, and Hasura. So basically, all of these applications allow you to store information, store your data in there, and use the API to grab that data. So you're not sending a database up with your code somewhere. You're able to just say, okay, here's the route to the API that I want to hit. This is the URL. When I'm going to click this and I want you to go to this URL, and then you pass the header information of get user bio avatar, okay, and then that sends that information back to populate your application. One step even beyond this are headless CMSs. Many of you may be familiar with CMSs in general, which are content management systems. WordPress is by far the most popular CMS, but now they're headless. Sounds gory, maybe, but it's not. So a headless CMS is basically, it's back-end only content management system, making content accessible through an API. So again, we're talking about APIs again, but this is with your content management system. So we're detaching that UI from your API. So the term headless actually comes from the concept of chopping the head or the front end, the website, the UI that you see off the body, which is considered like the back end or that content where your content lives. And the headless CMS remains with an interface to add content, and it uses a Restful API. REST is, let's just wiped it from my mind. But you're basically using CRUD actions, create, update, destroy, read. Create, read, update, destroy. But you're using that information and using like JSON or XML to get that information back whenever you need it. So because this approach basically says, I don't care where your content gets displayed. I'm just going to hold all of that content from you and give it to you with these API requests when you're ready. So the one focus of them is storing and delivering structured content. I'm getting a message, and I hope it's not from Slick because I can't see any other screen the way that my screen is up right now. Nonetheless, let's hope it's nothing critical. So here are some of the providers. Sanity.io is one of the most popular headless CMSs right now. There's a poll recently asking people what headless CMS they would use. Sanity is very quick and light. Flamelink exists for Firebase, Cosmic.js, TakeShape, and TakeShape, that top right corner, uses GraphQL, which is nice if you're familiar with GraphQL. And WordPress actually has an API system to be, headless WordPress. So if you're more familiar with WordPress, but you're a little wary about, the security of it, you can try just doing the content, having WordPress hold your content for you. Strapi is one that I've been using a lot lately. And we'll kind of look at Strapi's UI a little bit when we talk about developer experience. But Strapi also uses GraphQL and actually has a one-click install on DigitalOcean, which makes it a lot handier if you want to check that out. Contentful is another popular one. And then there's also Block. I think this is Block Story. Sorry, I just realized that I didn't have the label for this one. But these are all headless CMSs, so basically holding your content for you. And just holding your content so it doesn't care about how it's displayed. So it's a great way to get your data through API is with a headless CMS. Another important ring in the ladder of websites is authentication. And authentication, one, is usually very hard to set up, very scary to have broken. And usually you are used to talking back and forth to a server. here are some services that make it so you do not have to do that. Firebase, Auth0 is a really great one. Highly recommend checking out the content from their team. They do a lot of great tutorials, and that will give you kind of a way to just set up your authentication with a link or click, like low threshold setup. There's Okta, Netlify Identity, which I'll talk about a little bit in a second, and then Amplify and AuthPack. So a lot of these will rely on other things like OAuth2 and JWT, which are JSON web tokens, which are a great way to do to handle sign up and authentication and custom user data, gated content. I talk about it quite a bit in this post that I just made, specifically to Angular, but the setup for Netlify Identity is quite, it's pretty much the same through most frameworks and static site generators. But you can see here in this video, let me see. Yep, I need to click to play. So we have the site and we can just go to the identify page, enable identity, and all of a sudden the page now has a login button. You click that login button and you have a sign up and login option for people to enter their information, their email, and their password and sign up, and all of a sudden you have a new user in your identity dashboard. What's my favorite part about it is you can add third-party authentication providers, which is as simple as like you scroll down, go to external providers, and you say, I want to add all of them. Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab, and Google. And as you can even do your own credentials in there, or just do the default ones, which just means that it'll look like this. If you do default, it'll just show you, these are the ones I want to log in with. Great, you're logged in. So then you have that information in your dashboard from that third-party provider. Okay, there's a lot to cover because there's a lot that you can use in the Jamstack, so I'm gonna just keep going. E-commerce and payments. This is another process that people are like, well, if it's a static site, I can't do e-commerce site. I can't take payments. That's not true. You can. So there are different ones that you may be more familiar with, whether they're Snip more familiar with than others. Snipcart and Molten. Molten is actually considered as itself a headless commerce API. So again, we're talking about it's just storing that information of promotions and webhooks and carts and more, but it doesn't care how you display it. It's headless. It's just holding that information for you. Stripe is by far one of the more popular ones, and Jason Lingstorff and Thor from Stripe have done a lot of really great tutorials that I highly recommend checking out that walk through like adding a donation button so that you can get donations on your Jamstack site or your static site. And then there's also Square and PayPal that, Tito actually uses Stripe and PayPal, and I think maybe another process to do payment and checkout forms, etc. So you can do e-commerce. I didn't link it here, but I'll put it in the resources. But Sarah Drasner has a really great site walking through using Nuxt, and I'm not quite sure actually the API that she uses for the e-commerce and payment, but it walks you through the whole process, and it's a really great tutorial to walk through. And then there's a bunch, like I said, with Stripe on our blog and also on Learn with Jason. Learn with Jason. It's so hard not to say his name like Jason. It's probably not that hard. I just have a problem with it. So did you know that you could also do search? So search seems like such a dynamic thing, and you would think you can't use this technology in the Jamstack, but Algolia, that first one in particular, it takes all the searchable data and it gets the results through an API. Super fast. It makes these requests. So again, we're saying we get dynamic data through the API. And then there's Google Custom Search, which is like a mini search engine scoped by the URL that you can embed in your site. So if you're more familiar with using Google, you can have that option. And then there's also, I always feel like I say this wrong, Cloud SH Search. So that's just a few lines of JavaScript. And their forte was working in static sites, but it definitely would work in a Jamstack site. So these are all APIs. These are all the different functionality we can get just from APIs. So if we talk about serverless functions, this is a whole other way to be able to get dynamic information and interactions. Serverless functions are basically a single purpose function that you can create, and then it's hosted and maintained and executed by a cloud computing company. And this is why they're called serverless functions, because basically you're putting them up on a cloud somewhere. But the main key point of serverless is saying you don't have to worry about managing the servers. It's a very odd approach and name for something that includes servers, but who am I to judge? So this is basically a JavaScript function hosted and maintained by an infrastructure provider. So these serverless functions, they're programmatic functions. And a lot of times you want them to just take care of one thing so that they can execute it and be done. But again, the companies, the infrastructure providers will take care of the maintenance, will take care of the executions, and this way it can help deploy new code faster. So when we talked about Netlify identity, if you read that post, you'll see in an Angular application, and again, probably with most other static site generators and frameworks, in that demo, we're just serving an HTML page with some CSS. So in the HTML, the main index of the HTML file, there's a script tag that's saying, go get the JavaScript for the Netlify identity widget. And then in the template, we also have a tag that says Netlify identity widget. So we're not pushing any JavaScript up. We're just pushing up HTML and CSS. We're just deploying HTML and CSS. But it sees that script. That script is calling a serverless function that looks inside your application for where that widget is and populates it with the information dynamically, what needs to be there, and then does all the interactions of login dynamically through that serverless function. So that's how you get JavaScript capabilities without pushing any JavaScript up, without serving up any JavaScript. That is quite a concept to wrap your mind around. It was for me, because I'm like, but you need JavaScript. Shouldn't you put JavaScript somewhere? And it's like, it's there, but it's in a script tag, and it's calling a serverless function. And like Netlify, if you ever use Netlify, we have a whole like functions in the netlify.toml that you can point to a folder somewhere that holds all your Netlify functions. So you can have a bunch of different serverless functions that run while the site is going. There are a lot of places that have serverless functions. The big ones, Azure Functions, Google Cloud Functions, and AWS Lambda. I have worked with AWS in general. It's almost endless, the things that you can do on AWS. I personally have not had the easiest time with setup and finding the right documentation and just going through different things on AWS. So Netlify Functions actually is a wrapper for Lambda functions. So you're able to, I'll show you the code in this slide. So it's powered by AWS Functions. We're trying to make it as painless as possible. So you can write JavaScript or Go APIs to perform like any backend task or scaling them automatically as the demand increases for these tasks. And you can see this like function split test activated JS. So you're writing this handler, you're writing an AC, it does, you're writing whatever code you need as just your JavaScript function. And then we go in and we do all of the complex setup for you. I'm a fan of that. So we talked about APIs and serverless functions. And there is this really, 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 really great resource that I use all the time from Chris Coyier of CSS Tricks. He made at CSS Tricks Serverless, where he goes through and he says, on that right, you see it says, what are all these services that I need for my site? And then if he scrolls through a list, like these are the major providers, Netlify, Versal, Amazon, and then say I want a static site generator. Here's a whole list of static site generators. CMSs, we talked about e-commerce and payments, but there's monitoring and media and forms. So all these things that you may have thought before that you needed a server to do this functionality, there's some resources that show you that's not the case. So highly recommend checking that out, Serverless CSS Tricks. Our final bullet point is creating a better development experience through the automated workflow. It's a lot to say. So there's a lot wrapped up in creating a better development experience, but I think a lot of it can be talked about through talking about the Git workflow. I am a humongous fan of this because I don't like leaving my terminal. I like being in Vim. I like being in my terminal. So the Git workflow, and Git actually has a bunch of CLI tools now, GitHub that is, but nonetheless, so this Git flow is basically talking about utilizing Git repos and functionality like cloning, forking, pull requests, merge checks, and more to create easily distributed, checked, and quick interaction development process. So you're using Git to organize and check code from many devs. Right now, a lot of us are distributed. We're not in the same office. We can't just, constantly be over each other's shoulders, unfortunately. I personally have been working remotely for over 6 years. I like it. I like people, but I also like working remotely. But if I say to, Kat or somebody that needs to work on the code base, hey, I need you to add this section of the code base. I need you to add the functionality for search for Mongolia. All she'll need to do is go to the project's GitHub repo, clone or fork it down, be able to make a branch, make her own pull request, put that information up, add testing, and then I can look at the PR, be like, yeah, you're a brilliant, Kat. That was amazing. Have some checks done by our system, look at a deploy preview, and then be able to push the code up. And that's all we need to do. It's just much easier for developers to be able to make iterations in the code and have these rollbacks if anything breaks. So when I talk about checks, I just wanted to show you this here. I'm going to speed up a little more now, but I will have all these resources at the end. So for Netlify, we do this process. We definitely dog food everything that we make. But so when I put a new blog post up on the site, I automatically get a deploy preview thanks to Netlify's Git integration. So I can go in, see what it looks like, but nobody's going to happen to search deploy preview 3254, to know what we're seeing before it's ready for production. But I also have these checks, and it's as simple as things like, do you have a reviewer? If no one's reviewed this, you cannot merge this. They have to approve this merge. But it also is like, hey, what's been changed? What are the header rules? What are the redirect rules? Are they all passing? Check all of these things so that we don't have to worry about breaking things. It does these checks for us, which is really great for the development experience, knowing that those things are automated. So I can kind of get that off my brain. But also, these are in the best practices of Jamstack on jamstack.org, automated builds. So this is basically saying you're able to, like Netlifyedge has CI/CD so that it will build out whenever you push new code and push that new code up, but also atomic deploys so that until everything is up, nothing goes up. So there's no like disjointed content going up and seeing what has changed, what hasn't. It's all atomic deploys. Trash everything, put all the new stuff up. There are ways around this if you don't want to build every time to do select builds and be able to look at the cache. And we have that with our build plugins. That's a whole nother topic though. And then what we talked about with that rollback of being able to have immutable deploys or builds so that you can say, hey, I messed this up, go back a build. So all of these happen in that Git workflow. But quickly, I wanted to touch on the user experience as far as technical, like levels of technical ability. So talking about Strapi has a UI so that when I have somebody that I'm working with on the team that isn't familiar, doesn't like working with Git, or is just much more comfortable with the UI. This is how you make a new model in your API for Strapi. You basically go to add a content type, and you pick different things. You can pick different fields, add those fields with clicks of buttons, putting in text, and then I can see the code in my GitHub repo that now looks like this, and I can edit it there and make those changes there as well. So that's a huge thing with the Jamstack technology or Jamstack architecture. We want to make it more accessible for a lot of more developers, not having to worry about the technical ability. So we have things like with CMSs, being able to have that UI so that you can have as many content contributors as you possibly can for lots of content. And then total like in the dark nerds that just want to stay in the terminal and work on Git. You have that side of the content as well. We actually have what I showed you earlier in the Netlify GitHub. I created that article with the Netlify CMS, and then it made that PR for me in GitHub with a webhook. So you can do it those two options. Like that's basically the setup. But there's a lot more to that I'm happy to talk about some other time with you all. But what about more technologies? So there are other things that are coming to existence now. There's Redwood.js. And Tom Preston Warner headed this up, but it's talking about bringing full stack to the Jamstack. So there are a lot of different technologies you could use, or you could just do something that's kind of packaged up like Redwood.js that has routing, that has cells, which is basically retrieving data from the API and then showing loading placeholder and feeding that up. There's services that can be used by GraphQL and any other place in your backend, and generators to make the process of implementing all of these things easier, and even like dedicated forms working with Redwood.js. And this, there's a talk at JamstackConf where he goes over this, and he has the Batmobile behind him, like legit the Batmobile. That blew my mind. But all of these things that we talked about, if you want more of a pick and choose kind of scenario, highly recommend checking out the Netlify blog. One, because these articles are great, but like look at all the things we cover that we talked about, like e-commerce with Commerce.js and Netlify. We talked about live chat migrating from WordPress. This is DNS and how domains work, two-factor authentication we now have on Netlify, but talked about that Netlify identity, scaling, working with build plugins and Brotli, and their government sites made, Gatsby 101, talking about if you want to learn more about Gatsby, Strapi backends, build plugins, which help you customize your build, Next.js we talk about there. So there's just like a lot of things that we covered. We have and are constantly putting up new information on how to work with those on the Netlify blog. Another great resource is jamstack.org. So jamstack.org has this part on here called examples, and it walks through all of the different technologies that these websites are using. And I scroll a little slower to kind of show you, but there's a ton on there. So if you're like, well, what will work with Next? What will work with Hugo? That will give you a little example of all the different ones that you can have work with that. I'm going to wrap up there, and we'll have a few minutes for questions. I tried to make it at the 50 mark, but I got too excited about probably edge handlers of all the things. You can find me at TZ Mannix. I very much appreciate being here. So thank you very much for having me. And I think, oh, now I can look at your comments too. Let me stop sharing. Maybe, there we go. Hi, Slick. So let's see.
Hi.
So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the room.
So so if you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the chat box. So thank you for that amazing section. Tara, that was quite amazing. Thank you. We really appreciate that.
My pleasure.
That was very helpful and very informative, as someone said in the chat box. And so you can still, as we're having this conversation, you can drop your questions. So quickly, as you're dropping questions, so we actually going to welcome back Ben in an interactive section just for like 10 minutes with Tara. We want the community. They have a couple of questions from the Slido channel. So they feel. So we have some couple of questions.
Hello.
Slido questions. Hi Ben. So we feel it's actually a question that could actually answer both from the newbies who want to have more experience about the journey and some other things. So on joining me will be Vreda from Kenya, one of the DS elites. So she will be joining me on this section as well. So going straight to the first question. So the first question they asked, I think probably some of the devs are quite convincing regarding a lot of JavaScript frameworks going on. Yeah, everyone keep coming out, and some young devs, most devs, even the ones that are doing it yet, are convinced about the ones they actually want to go into. So I think that's one of the major reasons why this question I have to see. So for most people actually who are beginners, they ask that which JS type of JMs framework they should actually start with, and how they can dive into it. So in your whole opinion, Tara, you can go first. What JS do you think young developers or even the ones that are doing it could actually be best for them to start with, or probably are more interesting in the long run?
I actually think that, and I don't know how popular this answer will be, but working with just vanilla JavaScript or working with ECMAScript is extremely informative, will help you understand every JavaScript framework, and is very powerful. So I would even say skipping frameworks when you're starting with JavaScript and digging into, if you just search for free JavaScript kind of like tutorials and walkthrough, it's so powerful. You can do so much with it. And just learning those basics of JavaScript will help you go really far with any framework you end up using in the future.
Okay, thank you, Tara. So Ben, in your opinion, please, what JavaScript framework would you recommend a beginner to start with?
That's a good question. I don't really actually have a strong opinion about that. I mean, there's so many choices these days. I hate to say, oh, this is better, this is worse. Honestly, like React is pretty simple to start with. It's very widely used, tons of support available for that online. But I feel like maybe Tara has a better answer than I do because she's more involved in the frameworks of JavaScript than I am, probably. What do you think, Tara?
Well, I would say as far as framework, simpler is definitely Vue. So just like kind of baseline, simpler, I would say Vue. And then like as you start to wrap your mind around that, honestly, they all have state, they all have components, they all have a lot of similarities. So never feel stuck in one. And, you know, like Ben said earlier, Preact is such a nice, small, tiny package that it helps you spin up React apps super fast. So if you're just like, I want to get something done, you know, Preact is another way to go. But I think the biggest takeaway is start in whichever one sings true to you, and you're never stuck in one.
Yeah, Preact is great for making really small bundles. It doesn't have the same kind of online support that other frameworks have because it's not as widely adopted. So it's a good place to go to, but the first getting started part can be a little more challenging. Also, a framework isn't required. You can just use JavaScript. JavaScript is a fine language by itself.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for that question. Which is, I think a lot of them would have actually have more insight now on what to go about. So the next question is, how are you guys coping during this the COVID time, the pandemic everywhere, and what technical advice will you give to the young devs who are actually planning to work remotely, and how effectively have you been working in your own field, and so you can actually share with them so they could actually get more insight on remote work. So Ben, you can go first this time.
I was gonna have Tara go first. I thought I don't have any original ideas on this one. It's a super hard problem. It depends where you are. Like where I am over here, we were the hardest hit place in the United States at first. So it was the worst place you could be was near New York or in New York. We were in the thick of it. So we just pretty much stayed inside and didn't really go out that much for a long time. I'm lucky because I have a job. I work for Google, and Google has money lying around. So even if business is bad for a while, Google will still be here. So I was just fortunate that people I knew at work and other places just kept on getting online and getting on Hangouts with each other and various means to keep in communication. I feel like the days when I am just kind of doing things by myself are more challenging. I'm not used to working from home, and I find being around people kind of makes the world feel real for me. So there were days where I had like no deadlines. It was harder to get motivated sometimes. So I started doing all these talks actually, because doing talks, you've got a deadline. You're going to see people like in 2 days, and you got to get the talk together. I found that to be useful. As far as like getting programming projects done, I found it hard to get started sometimes. Once it gets started, you get involved in the project and you're like, oh, cool, I'm writing some code. It's working. That can be exciting. And also having someone else who is working with you makes it much easier, I think, or someone else who wants it or will see it makes it much easier. So my only advice is try to involve people. If you find yourself just kind of sinking away and thinking the world doesn't exist, try to involve people again, however you can.
And I definitely, one of the biggest things I would say is like this. Doing these virtual events, like Ben said, like he's doing more talks now. This is like, it's really great, just like seeing the comments in the chat and like, you know, being able to know that even though we're not in the same room, we're talking about the same thing together. We're learning the same stuff together. And that has a very humanizing thing to it that feels really nice, no matter how far apart we are. I also am very privileged in the way that I have this job that I've been working remote for 6 years. And I, you know, I live in Ohio where realty is cheap. So I have a house where I can be in a room with a computer. And so my team is like, it's fully distributed now, but even before this, we had, on my team in particular, every single person is in a different state, is in a different time zone, which makes it very interesting. But you can't neglect, or, you know, you can't be afraid of having too many meetings. Because it's like you have pairing meetings, you have discussion meetings. We even have what we call happy hour, where we just sit around and we talk for an hour. Because one, amazingly, we actually come up with some good ideas for content at that time, but also it just lets you unwind and just have that human contact with, you know, the people, hopefully, that you like the most in your company, which is your team. But again, find as many online like conferences and like this awesome web cluster webinar to really, you know, talk with people that you have so much in common with.
Yeah, if you have data and you have bandwidth to spare, then go on and do these things. It's remarkable. I've been doing these events now with people in various places in the world, and people show up from all over the place. You can have an event that's centered in France. People come from Brazil and India and Africa. And it's like the borders are up now and it's harder to travel anywhere, but the barriers have gone down like never before. You can just get online and see people from across the world immediately. If you don't have bandwidth, don't have data, then get on the phone, get texting, you know, just keep in contact with people.
Awesome, thank you. So I think Breda, So I think Veda has some questions, technical question for Tara. So Veda, can you unmute and can we hear? Can we hear you?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Token Ninja Daddy.
Just go ahead. You're on mute again.
Yeah, you're muted now. Before you were very audible, now you're totally muted. Oh no.
You're
Now we
mute.
can hear nothing.
You're mute.
There you go. Oh, no. Yes.
Okay, I think you have bad network.
Sorry. So I'd like you to explain the differences between the mean stack, the man stack, and Jamstack. Like, what are the differences between the three stacks?
So the main difference we're talking about with those stacks in general are reliance on the server. So the two biggest things we talk about with Jamstack, because a lot of people have a hard time, like, what's quantifying, like, what's a Jamstack? Because you don't have to have every single part of your site pre-rendered. But if you have pre-rendered content that is statically being served from a CDN, instead of setting up that server back and forth, that is what quantifies it as a Jamstack. And so that is like the main big difference, is like not having to worry about servers and server setup and that back and forth from servers to your content that the user is requesting. But you're still you're still using technologies that you're used to, like JavaScript. You're still using frameworks. The way that you're coding it out, you still use Git for version control. So there's a lot of similarities, but that's the biggest thing, is talking about servers and how things are served up.
Okay, go ahead, Veda.
Awesome. So the next question. Okay. So yes, the next question is, to some of those people who identify as female, what are some of the advices would you give them to be able to thrive in the technical industry?
The biggest one is other females. I know that that's a kind of an easy or like a seemingly easy answer, but finding strong, supportive females in roles that, like, I'm very, very lucky to have the lead of DevXP, Sarah Drasner, who is not only a genius, but a huge advocate for diversity in tech, for inclusion, for really awesome web projects. So having those role models, and then also finding allies, finding companies that actually believe in the equality amongst teams enough to pay you equally. Again, I feel very privileged that I had that in Netlify. It's not an easy battle. You don't find that everywhere. I didn't have that at my last job. But finding allies, finding other women, finding companies that share the understanding of how important equality is in the workforce. Again, these aren't easy battles, but you can also find places online to find other people in your situation that can help talk you through, how to ask for what you're worth, and what the signs are that you're not being treated fairly in the workplace. So ask a lot of questions. Like with programming, like with anything, half of our time is spent Googling stuff. Do that in all of these facets of your life that you may be unsure about. Always ask questions.
Oh, nice. That's really, really good. So one last question. Could you tell us more about your journey to Google Developer Expert? How is that going out for you from becoming one, and what you have done so far with the title? Or yes.
Mine is probably an unusual journey because I was like a computer nerd when I was a kid, and I got a computer science degree in college that got really into music. and I quit doing computer stuff and just played music for quite a while. And then I had like no money and had started having children. I'm like, oh, this is terrible. I thought, but I can't get involved again because everything's changed so much. But it turned out that I was able to find a startup that would hire me. I learned PHP and JavaScript on the job because, you know, programming is still programming. I just got back into it. And then I started getting calls from recruiters about places like, I was working at AOL. I started getting calls from recruiters about places like Amazon and Google. And I applied for Google and didn't get the job. But I really wanted to not be just an engineer. I wanted to actually be a person who still was around people. So I finally applied for Google again as a different job here that involves some person interaction, some human interaction, talking to some clients and doing some programming. I got that job. I just found myself doing more and more work kind of like this. I kind of found myself doing more work talking to people that have websites saying, oh, this is why your site is slow. You could just make your images smaller or use source set. And I really enjoyed talking to people. And then I started finding myself working more and more with developer advocates. And they asked me to apply for a job in the team. I was really surprised. So I applied and they let me in the team. I was surprised again. And it's just been, I feel very lucky again because I'm at a very privileged company and a privileged place. I got to run events around the world and go meet people and meet developers, like in places like, you know, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, other places, and just chat about the web and how to make things better for the web. So it's been, I feel lucky. So it's been kind of neat, and we'll see what happens next. All I can say is if you want to get a job like this, just do what you like doing. If you like meeting people and like trying to make demos and things online, then do that, and people will find you usually. There's plenty of wonderful people doing this kind of outreach work all over the world.
Wow.
A follow-up question to that is, I actually get this question a lot from like newbies who are getting in the technical industry, and their normal questions are like, how do you identify your stack? Do you know, like, if you want to work in back end, just fully front end, or want to dive into DevOps or things like that? So what advice would you give to someone who is struggling to identify the stack that they'd love to be in?
I'll go first if you want, Ben.
Yeah, sure.
So I actually, I still don't know. I think it's one of those things. So I went to school for CS. I did, you know, everywhere from like machine language to we worked with PHP. I learned all CS and Java. And I hated IDEs. I didn't like working with Eclipse. I didn't like how robust everything was to program out. So when I learned about JavaScript, I was really excited about JavaScript. But I started out as a Node.js developer working in the back end, and I worked for a platform as a service. So I was in and out of containers all the time, and I really loved working with infrastructure. I knew that I loved it more because I would spend the same amount of time on CSS trying to fix a bug that I would with trying to set up a, you know, DigitalOcean droplet and do some instance and add, you know, whatever technologies I needed to do on a droplet. I would spend the same amount of time on bugs on both of them. And with CSS, I would fix it and I'd be like, cool, fine. But then with the infrastructure, I'd be like, yeah, more, let's keep going. But the more I learn about CSS, the more I'm just amazed with what you can do with it. So then I get more excited about the front end. So I've had jobs that have me focusing on the front end, focusing on infrastructure, focusing on back end. And I definitely get feel more rewarded, and I feel more joy, like they say, when you're in the process of and in the coding zone. But I have this very fortunate outlook when it comes to coding that I really find joy in all of it and can get really stuck in the code. So I think if you find one that you fix a bug and you're just like, great, what? I have to touch it more. I have to work on it more. That's not the one for you. Don't do that. But beyond that, I think it's trying what you can, but also remembering that, you know, when you're working with any of these, you're learning something for working with all of them. So just know, like, you're learning logic, you're learning how the computer speaks. Like, so never take that as like, oh, I don't want to do this anymore, I wasted time. You're never wasting time with this.
That's a really good answer. It's a better answer than I'm going to give. The things I was going to say, you already have said, and there are things that everyone would have thought to say that you said. Yeah, like she's right. I mean, programming is really programming. So I think that people should do everything, honestly. If you don't have to specialize, then don't specialize, because it's all programming and all the skills you learn are useful everywhere. If you learn how to do things in the back end, they're useful on the front end. Not literally, you're using different technologies. You don't care about load balancing if you're writing JavaScript, at least not yet. But I think that the more you know, the better off you are. I think for me, when I started working back in programming again, I found front end more exciting because it was more close to what people actually would see. Back end involved more hardcore, real computer science stuff, which was a little more interesting. But I wanted people to see what I had done, so I could say, "Look, see this website here? Yeah, I did this part. This button is my button." I found that to be gratifying. But for me, what mattered more was the people I worked with, honestly. I could do anything. I remember like working on trying to revive a dead Joomla application, which was really tedious, and trying to do all kinds of crazy stuff and this customized PHP. It was fun though, because it did it with someone else watching it over my shoulder the whole time. It was a desperate agency person who was saying, "We broke the whole thing. Can you fix it?" And when I got it fixed, he was so excited. So I made him happy. So I think it's the people that matter the most, really.
Awesome. That's really, really good. So I don't have any questions from my end, so I'm going to hand it over to Sleek. So Sleek, unless you have many other questions to ask.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on, and we're so glad to have you to ask some very amazing questions. And a lot of people have been learning and show some insights. Actually, amazing to hear this. So moving on to, before we ask the final question, we'll just have to go through the chat box. I don't know, Ben, Tara, if you have a couple of questions. Tara, first, you have a question around Jamstack. If you can answer that, to just pick one or two, then.
I see questions about PHP over here. People making fun of PHP. I like PHP because PHP I think is fun. It's a big mess, but it's very, it's very flexible, and I think it's entertaining. PHP is still used out there. And if you're doing work with CMSs, like WordPress and like Drupal, they still use PHP. It's more gratifying probably to use like Python, other things that are more structured, I think. But PHP is not so bad. It may get, but you are regarded though as kind of a person who's sort of more old-fashioned. It's like learning like Fortran or something. So if you want to be modern and with it, there's more modern, cool things like JavaScript.
And then kind of working from the bottom up, I see the how well can Jamstack scale for heavy applications. I'm just going to assume that you're talking about data-heavy applications. This is, I also I have a talk with, it's Auth0 Live with Sam, Julene, and we talk about what is a Jamstack good for and what is it not. So the Jamstack, how we're serving up information when you have things like, say, IoT data points. You're getting a ton of data points, and you can't rebuild your application every time you get a new data point like that. Or you may not want to make, hit up the API for, thousands upon thousands of data points. So in that sense, thinking of heavy data in that way, it is not what you want to use. Easily said that way. But for other ones that like things like, I'm trying to think of, I can't pull this company off the top of my head, but they just moved like thousands of blog posts over to the Jamstack, which is seemingly a lot of data to render. But you're able to go into your build, and I know I don't want to call out any other CDNs, but I know that we do this with Netlify because I just did a whole bunch of stuff using build plugins. But you can use a build plugin to go into your build and say, here are the things that we already have built out. So look at the cache, see what we have built out, don't touch those. And so you're not rebuilding everything each time because it can see that information already cached. So when you have like 1,000 more or more, HTML files, you're not building them every time. So it seems heavy, but what you're creating is just the new content. So that's what I would say for that question.
I don't see much else on there. There's Jamstack questions. Fans of Vue, all right.
Oh, I see. How does Jamstack handle features that require a database in order to manage the transactions? So those are, again, API calls. So if you're talking about money transactions, you have specific APIs like Stripe that do all of that through API requests for you. If you're talking about data and database, again, there's, like we talked about, headless CMSs and different data like Firebase that has the ability to get all of that information through API requests. So again, it's all just having your code have the connections to the API to say, this is the information I need. I make that request to the API and get that data into my site. I hope that answers that. Most of the Jamstack development tools depends on third-party tools. If any cases where third-party tools shut down, what happens? Unfortunately, that's just something that we can't control, especially with third-party tools. Thankfully, a lot of the ecosystem is well established. Like we talked about, we had, talking about Stripe. Stripe's been around forever. PayPal, we use a lot of Google things in the Jamstack. Hopefully, Google's not going to shut down anytime soon. But that's kind of the name of the game with third-party tools. But always remember that you can make your own APIs. You can make your own serverless functions. So if it's smaller things that may be coming from somebody, a company or a team that's not as hasn't been around that long, or you don't feel comfortable with, there are ways that you can make things yourself, and then you don't shut down, and then you share it with everybody, and then we're golden.
I actually have to get off the phone so I can call someone back over here. I'm getting these phone calls from somebody. I think our car has been broken. The air conditioner isn't working. It's hot over here. So.
Is this a good time to go? Is that okay?
Yes. Yeah, that's fine. So thank you for coming on board. We really appreciate you. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Tara. That's the end of the section. And we're so glad that we have you guys on board. So maybe some other time we're still going to have you guys. Thank you very much. So see you guys next.
Yeah,
Bye.
Thanks so much for having us. See you next time.
Bye
again.
So thank you everyone. And that's the end of the webinar. So we're glad to have you guys on board, and we're going to be having an amazing section on board. On board, SK, Tammy, everyone, all the amazing GDG leads that have been part of this. Really appreciate you guys, and thank you for staying to the end of the webinar. So do make sure you subscribe on the channel so we could get notifications on our next event. And if you've not registered in the form, do make sure you register in the form so that. So thank you everyone for joining in, and we're so glad to have you guys. So bye for now, guys. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.